name is Jeanette Kirkham. I am a digitizer at Kimberbell, and I also write all the feature and mystery quilt books. Today we're talking about adding the sashing and the borders onto your quilts. And I know, like, when I very first started quilting, like, I would just put it on and sew it and trim it off when I was done. And I was like, what's all this measuring? Why would I need to do it? Until I found out the reason why you would want to measure and go to all that work. I know when you look at that page in the book and you're like, why do I have to measure so many times? And the reason is that you want your quilt to be square when you're finished. And so how would you know if it's square or not? So if you've ever folded a blanket together and matched all the corners and folded them together, and that bottom corner that's all the fold is just scawampus and it doesn't work, or you fold two corners together and the bottom doesn't match up, well, that's what it means to be square, is that you can fold it perfectly in quarters and fold it up and the blanket is all square. It also helps your long arm quilter. Well, thank you for having your quilt very square. It's a lot easier for them to quilt it when it's square. Sometimes and I've done this before, like I've had wavy borders because I've pulled when I've measured, and then they have to do little tucks in your borders, and it's just, you work so hard on your quilt, you just want it to be really nice when it's finished. So that's why you want to measure. It's just so that it's more precise and square when you're finished. So you should have all 4 rows of your quilt sewn together, and you're going to just measure across the length of all 4 of those, and then you're going to add that number, add them all together and divide it by 4. So you'll have that one number, and you're going to just take your inner sashing strip and you're just going to cut 3 of those, and you're just going to sew those together. So you'll have the whole quilt center. So just for the purposes of this video, this is going to be the center of my quilt, and we'll talk about adding borders onto the quilt. So if you have your quilt all put together and those sashing borders with your rows, what you're going to do is go ahead and take a tape measure, and you're just going to measure just through the center of your quilt. Sometimes if it's a bigger quilt, I will measure the top, the middle, and the bottom, and then I'll take the average of those numbers. But for this smaller quilt, you should be able to just measure right through the middle. So this says it's just barely under 12 inches. So you would just take your sashing strip and you cut a piece of fabric. You'd cut 2 pieces so that you could put those on either side of your quilt. But I wanted to show you this. I don't pin a lot when I sew, but when I put on borders, I pin a lot. That's one of the places it's really important to pin. So if you've measured across the middle and you're going to put your sashing piece on, and you put it on one side, and you can see it doesn't line up. You're like, how am I supposed to sew that on? So the trick to getting that on and to easing that into the piece of fabric is how you pin your fabric. So when you pin on your borders, you want to start on one side, and you'll put a pin in one side, and then you pin it and lining up the edges on the other side. So you can see my bubble has moved to the middle. So I'm pinning this other side. And then I'm just going to lift this up a little bit and show you. So next, you kind of just pull them apart until you can see where the middle is between them. So then you kind of mark the middle, and you're going to pin that. And over a longer span of the whole quilt, like that 1/4 inch isn't going to be as big of a deal as it looks like here. And then again, you're just going to take between 2 more, and you're going to pull them apart, and you're just dividing that excess fabric the whole way. So down both sides of the quilt, you're going to do that. You're just going to take what you have in half and pin it in half and pin it in half and pin it across the whole length until all of your pins are about 5 to 6 inches apart. And so then you're going to take this and you're going to feed it into your sewing machine. So I'd be feeding it into my sewing machine like this. And as you sew, you hold your next pin point and you just pull just a little bit and give it a little bit of pressure. And then your feed dogs are just going to pull that fabric on top a little. The top fabric will just feed under your machine needle just a little bit faster than the bottom fabric is, and you'll be able to sew that on and that 1/4 inch will just disappear along the whole length. So you want to do that to both sides. So I have one here that you can see I've done both sides on. So I have both sides. So when you press, remember, we want to press. So you press first to set the seam, and since we're pressing towards the borders, you press here and then you flip it up and you press from the inside of your quilt like this. So you want to press your borders really well, and then we're going to measure again. So this time we're measuring, so see, we measured across this way and we added the borders the same direction we measured, and this time you would measure with the borders. So you add the borders to that measurement. So I'm measuring my center plus the borders, and that's the new number that you would cut. So then I would cut those and I would sew those on to either side here. So then you would just repeat that same process with your outer border, measuring again every additional border that you sew on. So you'd sew your outer border to the quilt. So after you finish sewing on the borders of your quilts, you can go ahead and get it quilted, and you want to bind it before you move on to the embellishments. So quilting and binding, you can either contact your favorite quilt shop and see if they have a service to quilts, or they might have a class that you could take to learn to free motion quilt your own quilts. And then also a class that you could take in order to learn how to bind your quilt so that you can get it finished